So, good evening, everybody in the Bruno Kreisky Forum. A warm welcome to everybody to you who is physically there, and also a warm welcome to our audiences in the digital sphere. Here I don't say good evening because you watch it maybe in the morning or in the noon or in the afternoon or in the evening. Welcome to this situation in the Kreisky Forum. I, for myself personally, I'm sitting here the first time since March 10 or March 11th. So this is a very, it's not a common situation for me too. Because, as you can imagine, in the last months we did a lot of things only in the digital sphere, and so now we have, or at least at the end I have the first opportunity and the pleasure to have also a presence meeting here. So I say a warm welcome to our friend Albena Azmanova. Wonderful to have you here. She is a professor or assistant professor at the University of Brussels. At the university here I have it. She's associate professor at the University of Kent, Brussels, and she is the author of the book about we want to talk today, Capitalism on Edge. Capitalism on Edge. What this might mean to be on the edge, we will also speak today. And I have also the pleasure that our friend and my friend Ivan Krastev, he is, for example, chairman of the Center for Liberal Strategies in Sofia. It's a Bulgarian think tank, political think tank, and he is also permanent fellow of the Institute for Human Sciences, the IWM in Wien, which is a competing institute in Vienna. Wonderful to have you here again too, Ivan. So to start, I read this book and I think it's totally interesting because we are talking about fear, we are talking about insecurity, and we are talking about uncertainty. And what could be better to talk about in these days? Because there are a lot of anxieties in the world, more than maybe as you wrote the book. And as I read it, I thought about, or it came to my memory, an essay, a text of the famous French historian Lucien Febvre, who wrote a piece. I only had it in German. In German it's called Das Bedürfnis nach Sicherheit zur Geschichte eines Gefühls. I tried to translate the desire for safety or the need for safety on the history of a political emotion. In the context we can understand it as a political emotion. That means that if there is a feeling of uncertainty in the world, then people have the need of the feeling of safety. And your main issue is about that this feeling of safety went away in the last decades. You are speaking about the issue, or you use the term precarity capitalism. And we talked a lot about precarity in these last months. People who are working or their lives and their working situation is in deep precarity, but you use the term precarity in a broader sense, I assume. So my first question would be, what do you understand if you use the word precarity capitalism?
So I chose deliberately this rather, unusual and new term in the English language. Mm-hmm. Precarity. The French have précarité.
Yeah.
In English, we talk about not about precarity, but precariousness, mm-hmm. right? As this uncertainty of the human existence, for instance. And only in Yeah, so the Collins Dictionary introduced the word precarity only in 2017. So something is going on to make, to mainstream this new word. And let me tell you a little bit the story of why I decided to embrace this term as the name of the type of society we inhabit. So I started researching this book about 10 years ago, when in the aftermath of the financial meltdown, people started talking about the crisis of capitalism. You know, even the Financial Times was running a series of articles, Capitalism in Crisis. And then, you know, esteemed figures such as Barack Obama was telling us the real problem of the world, and especially the Western world, is growing inequality. And somehow it didn't chime right. This diagnosis of a capitalism in crisis and that the problem is the obscene inequalities did not ring true to me. So I thought that this obsession with inequality and the narrative of crisis is using an available, habitual kind of available language to actually express a new grievance. And that grievance is the massive uncertainty that has afflicted even the rich, the well-employed, the people whom we all so envy are actually under such pressures that their condition can be described as precarious. Their experience of their life can be described as precarious. So using that term, but not in the language it was used before. For instance, Guy Standing, the sociologist, the British sociologist, uses the term from proletariat, precariat. He talks about, those who are impoverished. So we used to talk about the precarious work as the work of the impoverished and such insecure contracts. But my thesis here in this book is that the condition of precarity has become the general state of everybody. Men and women, rich and poor, irrespectively of employment status or how much you're paid, you're afflicted by this new condition of generalized precarity. And I believe that this is in fact the engine of the rise of populism.
Before we talk about populism, and it is obvious why the feeling of uncertainty and of unsafety is fueling populism, I want to stay at this point, because usually also in the German, maybe also because if we in German language speak about Prekarität, we usually understand this special insecure kinds of working conditions, what only a segment of the working classes has. But I think you are totally right, and that's the reason I want to talk with you about this a little longer, that this feeling of uncertainty is in far more segments there, because there's this uncertainty also for the workers in the usual well-paid and jobs and in the industries with high security, automobile workers. They have the experience of 30 years structural reform, and they know now I have a good job, but I cannot be sure to have it in 2 years still. And they know also that there's much more insecurity on the housing market. So there are so many experiences of insecurity.
Exactly, and it's about two things. It is not just about having lost your job. It's about perceptions and about anticipation that it might happen to you. Now, I came across a survey in 2015 in the US, a survey of millionaires. So about close to 90% of them declared living in fear of losing it all. And that is why they stay on the job, otherwise they would. So this losing it all is exactly the way
Yeah.
the majority of people feel.
Yeah. Because I also talked with a workers' representative in the automobile industry, MAN in Steyr, some months ago, and he told me the story of his life in a way. And he said at the beginning of the 90s, the fear started in the factory, and he and also his co-workers were for sure also the next 30 or 20 years in the job, but he said also, and this fear didn't diminish. It never diminished. And now we see in these days that this factory will be closed, so they were right to have this fear.
And also remember that the 90s was the most prosperous decade in the 20th century in terms of economic growth. Germany had some crisis, but overall in the Western world that was, low unemployment, good growth, and yet it is then that populist parties started to mobilize. A lot of the commentators now say, they were in books about populism, they attribute that to the impoverishment that followed the financial crisis. But actually, no, these things started already happening in the 90s. In fact, I was lucky how I fell into this theme, that a group at the European Parliament asked me to research how come in conditions of good growth, socialist left parties were losing power. So I started actually researching this problem around 2002, much before the economic crisis, and published my first piece about that in 2004. But basically advising the left to take this insecurity, I was not calling it precarity at the time, seriously. Otherwise they would lose the vote.
So now we can also come to the issue of populism. You say, I try to simplify it now, in a way you say that the left, the old left is dying because this geopolitical, or the political geography changes totally. Because the question is still not anymore left or right. The difference is now if you are on the risk side, if you feel a lack of safety, or the other side. And this is the political split of the days, and this changes everything.
Yes, and it's whether you see the new economy of open borders and technological IT development, whether you see it as an opportunity to have a very flexible, more control of your lifestyle, more investments, whether you see that as an opportunity or as a risk, is exactly the factor that now at least has a political relevance. We still use the left-right labels, but they're not helping us understand this aggregation of people's preferences. And so there is a lot of people who are, expressing concerns with four very, important things, like physical insecurity, especially since the terrorist attacks. So physical insecurity, employment insecurity, that's the economic component. So we have the physical component, the economic component. The political component is this concern with abuse of power, with law and disorder, concerns with corruption, mismanagement. There were a lot of scandals back in the 90s already. So that's the political component. What are we missing economically? And the cultural component. Fear that our lifestyle is going to be disturbed by people coming from abroad. So we have very clear components of a new agenda that cannot be located very easily along the left-right continuum, because these people want usually free markets but social protection. They depend our national capitalism, they hate global capitalism. So these kind of preferences do not align on the left-right continuum, and they do not follow capital versus labor conflict. I mean, if you look who are the people on the streets in Paris, the yellow vests, there are also owners of small enterprises. There is no working class versus capital anymore. So this is again driven by this precarization that cuts across the capital-labor divide.
I think we should talk a lot in the next minutes about how this changes the political geography. In that point, I'm not totally convinced, because I would also have some counter arguments, and if you also talking about these varieties of capitalism, liberal capitalism afterwards, welfare capitalism, the third is neoliberal capitalism, and I'm not so convinced if there is a new form, if it is so impossible that there is a new form of welfare capitalism, the next stage, which can be driven by the normal political answers of the democratic left. But we can discuss this in the next minutes. First, I want to give Ivan the opportunity now to intervene in these first questions, the question of insecurity and this analysis about the populist, we now call it, for the sake of the argument, populist, but this anti-risk political current.
No, I like very much the idea of the precarious, something which is different than the normal anxiety. Because listen, this idea of anxiety psychologically is there. Precarious was very much connected to the flexibility of the labor market. But people forget that flexibility of the labor market was perceived initially as something which is very good. Listen, having a part-time job, being able not to work for 12 hours per day, was perceived as fine. And one of the biggest problems which came with the global financial crisis is you believed that working class and having a kind of a freelance type of a job was your choice, and then basically understand that you don't have any other option. So I do believe that change, the fear comes in a normal, because listen, the world was not very safe even before. People are losing jobs, so it's not that you have this kind of a great safety. But what you fear being, for example, a worker is that somebody else is going to take your job. Now the fear is that your job is going to disappear. I was trying basically to talk to my kids. They don't know the meaning of the word stenographer. But 100 years ago, stenographer was one of the very prestigious professions, and particularly for young women with a certain education, basically to become a stenographer was a very prestigious story. So the whole jobs are disappearing. And then basically you are threatened not by other worker or not by all this, but the very kind of a constant change in society with which you cannot go. And from this point of view, there is something that is important for me, and I do believe, Albena, it fits to your general argument, but I went on your index in the book. And there is one word which is missing, and this was the word meritocracy. And the word meritocracy is quite important because, by the way, there is a great book by an American social scientist, David Markowitz, called The Meritocracy Trap, which is making an argument that probably is going to be interesting. I'm just presenting his argument. Listen, there was a time, particularly in aristocratic age, when the elite was called the leisure class. Basically, to be part of the elite, you have free time, you're not much working, and you're inheriting your position easily. And the workers working for 12, for 13, for 14 hours per day. Now, if you see who is spending most time in working, basically it's much more the CEOs of the big companies. So the leisure class, in a certain way, is somewhere else. The problem with the meritocracy is that also you cannot inherit easily the position of the elite. You should try to invest in education of your kids. They should go to the best universities. You're going to spend incredible money, particularly in the United States, for this to happen. So as a result of it, you end up with the elites, which feels incredibly anxious and precarious. Listen, these are people that are making millions of dollars. But the problem is not how much money you make. The problem is how much you have. What is the capacity to make money now? This is what really matters. And I find this interesting because this idea of the generalization of insecurity comes from total radicalization of competition in society. People are competing all the time about everything with everybody. And on one level, this is positive. Basically, this is how the society functions. But on the other, it makes people unhappy. Not simply the losers, the winners feel unhappy. And I find this quite important, and this is my last point, is that you're right that when it comes to the populist parties, we use the fear and anxiety very much as synonymous. But anxiety is a diffused fear. When you're anxious, you fear everything. That the world is going in the wrong direction, that everything is not in the way it should be. The fear is something very concrete, and from this point of view, COVID-19 was a great example. You are not fearing about anything, you're fearing of being infected. And this is changing your life. And the populist parties did not benefit from this. And they didn't benefit from this exactly because when you have a real fear, you're looking for protection. When basically you are anxious, you are very much also looking for somebody to represent how you feel. And the populist parties were great at this. So from this point of view, it's interesting because your major argument in the way I'm reading it, and I also read the book with a huge interest, is that you're saying the left is making a major mistake focusing on social inequality. Not because the social inequality is not a problem and not because it is not there, but you cannot mobilize on the social inequalities because people are not living in a constant comparisons. What really matters is this sense of insecurity, which basically is also not easy to mobilize on because everybody is insecure. So this is not the characteristics of the losers. In a strange way, one of the most insecure people are the people who seen from outside are doing best. And Albena was telling me that she was seeing some data showing that, for example, if the mental illnesses before were much more spread among the working classes, now if you see the percent of the people with mental sickness, basically it go very much with the top, with financially extremely wealthy and others and so on. So from this point of view, in my view, this is an interesting way to talk about society because this based the politics on a certain experience on which one is shared. Everybody is insecure, but it's one thing to be insecure of having too many houses and not to know where to go, and on the other, basically insecure of not having a house. So from this point of view, if you're not going to be able to basically distinguish between these insecurities, then the change is going to come simply, let's change our way of life. And this is also not the way it's easy to politically mobilize.
Right. Now, just to take it from here, there are 2 points that seem to be clashing, but they're not. Now, this rise of insecurity paralleled with the shift of the vote to the right. The center, so in the midst of the biggest economic crisis we've had, the vote went to the far right and to the center right. So all of a sudden the left was wondering, how come? I mean, there's a crisis of capitalism, people are getting impoverished, and they're shifting the vote to the right. Well, and there was the busting of one of the big myths of the left, that crisis makes people shift to the left. Actually, in conditions of insecurity, people become more conservative. You know, they cling to whatever they already know. They're hungry for security, so the vote goes to the right. But then there is another development there, that even the winners in this game of competitive pursuit of profit, wealth, etc., they start hating the game. So what actually drove me to write that book is this intuition that when we live in a time when even the winners of the game hate the game, it's a very interesting moment of history we inhabit. And I think, well, I published the book in January, and the pandemic hit in February. So I think the pandemic is just deepening these processes. It is, in a way, an outcome of this fragilization of society.
But you're not saying that the pandemic was part of your book promotion exercise.
No, I'm so sorry to have been so right. But it was an outcome of this general fragility of these Western societies. I mean, listen, we can edit DNA. We collect our societies, our scientists. We collect matter from Saturn's moons. or measure the gravitational waves of the universe, whatever that is. But our society struggle to provide for the basic safety equipment of doctors and nurses. So it is because of this structural fragilization of society, with slashing public funds, especially for healthcare, etc. But also this individual fragilization that this is one of the contradictions of capitalism I describe. We can produce our life technologically, we are very well equipped to produce our life with very little labor, but we rely more and more on holding a job, right? And at the same time, those good jobs are running away, are diminishing, disappearing. So we're in a situation where we rely more on our paid work. That paid work is about to, it's not available. And public investment in services is diminishing. This is what is creating this fragility.
So, but the first thing I would give you as a counter argument is that you say, in a way, that the problem of the traditional left is that they cannot address this. They cannot also address is with their vision of socialism, or a soft vision of socialism, yes. And they cannot address their usual idea of modernization or democratization or of some utopian kind of life in a time when people become conservative because they fear change, yeah. And not only they fear change, the experience of change of the last 20, 30 years is that this change brings more stress to their lives.
Exactly.
So. Exactly. This is your argument, but my counter-argument would be that the old left did totally address exactly that. I think George Orwell was it who said one time, if normal people think about socialism, they mean less working hours, a secure job, want a better payment, and no boss that commands them. So that was the real fuel for the traditional left, compared afterwards with this Keynesian welfare state element, which also had all these implementations of more jobs, better and more secure jobs, yeah. Better paying, and a more dynamic capitalism, right. Because better paying transforms in wealth creation and in economic demand. So it was a win-win situation for the left and for the capitalism. And when I read your book to the end, you say the same thing. So, what the medicine you are talking about is this traditional welfare state, socialism, Keynesianism. We knew.
Okay, thank you for pushing me to clarify that. Now, when I say that we do not need to embrace socialism, I say that because I see that there is not that the label of socialism has been so discredited by the experience with the dictatorships in Eastern Europe that you cannot mobilize sufficiently big mass of people with that label. So if we don't have a plausible utopia, irrespectively of what I personally believe, I would endorse some sort of a liberal socialism. But I'm looking at the current situation. We do not have a reliable utopia. There is no crisis of capitalism, because in terms of as an engine of prosperity it was working. And there is no revolution coming. So given that, do we have to give up hope for radical change? I say no. Yeah. Exactly because a lot of the winners and the losers of that game hate the game. So we don't have to give a label to the direction where we're going in order to fight kind of the dynamics that are making everybody miserable. And those dynamics are the competitive pursuit of profit. Now, my bone with the contemporary left, of course, in the tradition of leftist thought, they're wonderful strands, but the contemporary left is so fixated on the issue of private property and on inequality, that I think both are dead end. For the contemporary context, maybe they were appropriate for specific times in the past, but currently the issue cannot be solved as the likes of Thomas Piketty propose, for instance, with radical redistribution. First of all, let me say that I believe that very strongly that a fixation on the concern with inequality is neoliberal in its essence. It is an artifact of neoliberal thinking to think about people's life only in terms of personal circumstances, because the comparison, when we talk about inequality, we compare individuals with other individuals, and then the solution is some sort of a redistribution, again, personal circumstances. The socialist tradition is about, what are the social conditions? So how are the commons run? How is our investment in healthcare, education, etc.? Because once you take care of these crucially important things, how rich people are from then on, it becomes irrelevant, right? So you don't have to get into this egalitarian, autocratic, almost, Of course, I've lived under socialism. I remember how this equality did not create, first of all, the equality we had was forced, and it did not create a solidaristic society. Or the great idea of socialism is not about equality. Remember the dictum of Marx about communism? From everybody according to their capacity to everybody according to their need. That is not egalitarian. The key word is solidaristic society.
But here's my question. If you go with the precariousness, and as I told you, I find a huge sympathy with this insecurity, but it's different than insecurity that basically you have as a working class in the 19th century, because it's highly individualized.
Yeah.
So you expect the state to be equal to everybody, and this is Streck's argument, but you also expect the states to treat you very individually. In a certain way, you expected the state to treat you in the way the market is treating you.
Right.
Because the market is about individualizing this. Yeah. So you want basically the state first to recognize your particular vulnerabilities. And this was not by accident that this idea of a precarious society very easily go to the identity politics. Because they basically, what you represent is different vulnerabilities of the different social groups. Everybody have the feeling that they are not understood, that they are positioned in a different story. Legitimately or illegitimately, it doesn't matter. So I'm asking this because from this point of view, it's not easy to go to a solidaristic society. Because this individualization of insecurity is making it very difficult for any collective project and the state to do it. Because, okay, you're saying welfare state, and the welfare state can respond to some of the basic needs. Basically, obviously, the well-funded welfare states like Germany or Denmark or Austria were responding much better to the COVID-19 than what happened in the United States. But then you're going to go to a totally different fears, psychological stresses of the people, how you're doing, how we're treated respectively. I'm different than others. My kind of insecurity is not your insecurity. And this is not easy for the state to respond, even well-funded state. And for me, this is one of the major kind of a story that we see is that the classical idea is that we're equal because of our basic needs are the same. And then you can go with the people and say, listen, probably we're very different as human beings, but we are going to respond to your basic needs.
But you're talking about this element of the welfare state that is responsible for redistribution.
Yeah, but also which is basic public services. In a certain way, there are things that we're doing together. I mean, when you go, of course, to the underground or to the metro, you should take care for people who have some difficulties to go there. But basically, this is a common need. The problem is, and I do believe this is the interesting story, and this is the major kind of a challenge that you, I do believe, also identified with the collective left, is you have a society composed of individualized insecurity. We all share insecurity. It is universalized, but I'm telling you, you don't know anything about my insecurity. are insecure in a very different way. And this is not easy, and I do believe this is why it's so difficult to respond, and this is why the populist parties are making something very simple. So they're not addressing, they're not giving protection, they're giving expression. And this is also interesting when you say that people are not interested about inequality. They're interested in one particular case. There is a lot of studies in the United States. I do believe this was the same in France. For example, the Trump supporters don't care very much about social inequality, rich versus poor. They don't hate the rich, with one exception: those who have become rich on the basis of a good education. In a certain way, this is the Harvard rich. If you're making basically a huge amount of money based on selling flowers, you can be as rich as you want and your lifestyle does not go. And this idea of the educated class as being hated for making this because of education is a very specific figure of some of these populist movements, which are also not against any elite.
But they also hate the poor. They also hate the poor because they say we are the hardworking people, and also if they don't earn too much, they are harder working than the people on social security.
Totally.
But this is not totally. This is not new in the 19th.
Totally.
In the 19th centuries, the working class wasn't. Had the feeling of solidarity with the real poor, because there was one thing: they don't want to become the poor.
And listen, the idea in Bulgaria, we have this great example. Basically, the Roma community, which is by far the most in the most difficult position and basically the most discriminated, and the political elites are perceived as twins. Both of them are perceived as privileged for the three following reasons. Both of them are not like you. Both of them basically are stealing, and both of them are supported by the external forces, be it European Union, this being that. So from this point of view, you are constructing the idea of the hinterland, which is besieged of a coalition from the elites on the top and normally immigrants and very poor coming from below. And this is what is becoming, and because they have the feeling that the middle class society is in danger, and they see basically these two kind of groups very much also in a coalition. And I do believe this is interesting, and this is why it is quite interesting to see, for example, in the case of the electoral support for President Trump, one of the major stories, it's not basically the incomes that are decisive, but the regions in the United States which voted highest about President Trump in 2016 was the parts of the country in which the number of people who get college education went up fastest in the last 10 years. So before you have been on the same incomes, 60% of the community didn't have a college education, and then suddenly some people got a college education. And then suddenly your position changed. When 60% does not have a college education, not having a college education is not a problem. When 20-30% goes, on the other side, the people who got a college education get nervous too, because they put a lot of money in order to go to some of these community colleges, and we're not talking Oxford, we're not talking Harvard, and they expected that they're going to get a big improvement of their basically economic situation as a result of it, and they're not going to get this improvement. And I do believe all these are different forms of your kind of precariousness, where the flexibility and the possibility and social mobility is now perceived as a threat.
Right. So on this issue about kind of competing or clashing precarities, because indeed precarity is strongly stratified, not only stratified, but very diverse. For political forces and analysts, what I'm proposing in the book is that we take seriously these grievances, seriously, but not on their face value. So the next step is to see what is their common denominator, because especially if you take the antagonists, you might discover that they have actually the engine of their grievance is the same. And the class enemies might become, in fact, joint forces. For instance, take those young people in Spain, the youth unemployment is above 20%. At the same time, people well-skilled complain and well-paid complain that they can never, leave the treadmill, so that they can never exit the labor market. So what stands behind those grievances, that they seem so incompatible, is in fact this kind of political economy which does not provide enough jobs. It is making everybody's survival dependent on holding a job, which is insecure, and therefore even people who can step out cling on to it. So it is the nature of the political economy that is the common engine of these diverse precarities. So the responsibility of analyst is to spell these things out. The responsibility of the politician is to take this on board rather than use shortcuts as kick out the immigrants who are taking away your job, because these have been exactly the substitutes for reform of the political economy. You give shortcuts.
Now, if we imagine contemporary left, that is also in power. It's far away in many countries, but this this must not be, or it need not to be. If we imagine it, let's say that invests much more in the welfare state in the classical form. That is the first and not even the most interesting thing. Second, doing something like public job guarantee, as it, for example, the MMT theorists have to think about. And the second point would be if they be a little bit more cultural conservative to meet the desires of the people for safety. Let's put it that way, be more Joe Biden than Hillary Clinton or than Obama, or be more Keir Starmer than Corbyn, or be more Michael Ludwig than Michael Häupl. Would it be the picture you have in mind?
No, not exactly. So, first of all, when we talk about the return to the welfare state, it's become very fashionable now. Usually we have in mind two things, so let's clarify which welfare state. The New Deal that came in the 30s,
the investing state, I mean.
But the welfare state before the Second World War was one animal, and after the Second World War was a very different thing. So before, so the original welfare state, both in Europe and the US, was about public expenditure, job creation, taking care of the commons, and not worry about growth at all. Now, and this is basically what Keynes had in mind. Now, the way the welfare state was redesigned, and that's why I call it a pseudo-Keynesian after the Second World War, it was to boost demand. Under Kennedy, it was to lift all the boats. So this individualistic approach, through forced or fostered consumption, was a very nefarious thing that was created because it destroyed the environment. It created terrible consumerism that gave us this entitlement, idea of social justice as the entitlement to be middle class and increasingly affluent. So I would not embrace a return to this welfare state. I don't think that we need to return to cultural conservatism. No, actually I'm very much afraid of that. No, I think that people are becoming cultural conservative because their livelihoods are unstable. Stabilize the livelihoods and people will embrace change. Remember, I think that the last radical kind of brave thinking was in 1968. But this generation grew up in relative affluence, instability, so they could think about rebelling against the bourgeois comfort, and embrace, look for alternatives. You need to stabilize the livelihoods of people, and then they might venture into experimentation.
But is it not that then change was a choice? People wanted change. And now basically change is a reality which you cannot escape. And part of it goes with technology, with mobility, things that normally we like. And I do believe, because when you say, and I agree very much with you, this move to cultural conservatism on the left can be perceived very strongly in most of the social democratic parties that won recent elections. Denmark is a classical example. If you go with the welfare state, basically you said, I am for kind of a progressive protectionism. I'm going to protect my own workers, because how you're giving stability? You're giving stability by exclusion. In order to be sure, because this is the interesting story, when you're trying to reduce competitiveness, and this is changing to the left. Left used to be very internationalist, but it was very internationalist when there was the idea of a global revolution, good or bad, where you believe that workers in Austria feel closer to the workers in France than basically to the bourgeoisie in Austria. And this is not there anymore. And this level of a social mobility, which people are moving all the time, by the way, people on the top, but also people at the bottom are moving a lot. This creates this challenge, how you are going to give sense of security when security does not mean that you can stop change, because you cannot stop change. And you cannot stop change because we can decide here in this room that we are not going to compete with anybody. But you cannot basically tell the Chinese stop to compete. You cannot talk to the Africans who are not affluent at all, stop to compete. Because for them this is the only way basically to enter the game. And I do believe this has changed a lot. And one of the interesting things that you have is certain type of a nationalization of the left.
But what you make very strong in your book is that we have to fight the spirit of competition in a way that destroys our lives, our daily lives, but also on a broader level, that every company has the feeling it has the competition on a global level, which makes it easy to say, okay, we have to cut down wages, and at the end, there is on the one hand the competitiveness of the company, and on the other hand the diminishing living standards of the people. We have to bring out this totally spirit of competitiveness out of our livelihoods. That's your answer.
That is I feel very strongly about that. Especially when three things combine, it becomes very toxic. Competition, production, because you can compete about sports and culture, right? Competition, production, and profit. So when these three combine, so we have to kind of put it apart, split them. Then we are in a very terrible situation, because we're competing for the wrong things, and we're competing, incessantly. Through the production, basically, of consumer goods. We are competing who is going to produce more growth, and growth is counted as output of goods and services. Whether you need them or not, hey, you have promised your electorate growth, and so you deliver it.
But can I challenge you with this? Imagine that I'm a young African with a good education. Your basically position, let's stop compete, is very convincing if you're on the winning side. But basically, if I'm on the bottom, stop competing means basically stay where you are. And this is the biggest problem of the globalization, is that this is very attractive for us. But this is very attractive.
Maybe Kennedy was right with raising all the boats, because raising all the boats means everybody can win and nobody has to lose.
But this, and this is on which level? Because paradoxically, globalization, as we know it, contributed to basically declining inequality between societies, but increase inequalities within societies. And this is where it goes, and I do believe that you're absolutely right. In a certain way, the basic problem is how the West can send the message to the other parts of the world, listen, competing like crazy is not going to make anybody happy, when others believe that our message is, listen, we are fine. And as a result of it, we don't want to compete with you because you are kind of an ambitious and so on. And this is an interesting issue because, for example, you say about big corporations. If you're going to Google and say, let's reduce the competition, Google will be very happy to do this.
No.
Because when
Okay.
you're in a position of power, reducing competition works well.
Right, but remember the goal of competition is to eliminate the competition. That's
Yeah,
the game.
absolutely.
So actually they are the full proof that competition is very important. This is the one of the big problems of the left, of how to reconcile internationalism, right? Complicity with the workers of the world, with our workers that are threatened. So that's the left really needs to address that. But there is a way to address that, and it is to ask, competition for what? As I said, it's very important to ask for what. So if we change the terms of competition through, especially through, rules of globalization, that is the trade deals to be renegotiated, and the EU seems to be going in that direction, that you renegotiate all of the trade agreements to include very high environmental and labor standards. This will change the nature of competition with these societies, and this might actually improve the way workers live, the way they produce their life. So without really eliminating the production networks, you just change the rules of competition.
I think we'll figure that out in the next years to come. I think there's a good possibility that we can do that, because the way governments and states have to get involved in the economy will change for a reason of the crisis. We don't know yet in which way, but I would have two more questions, short questions, before we involve our audience, and they are about the title and the subtitle of your book. The first question is about the subtitle. You said, how fighting precarity can achieve radical change without crisis or utopia. So I understand that we don't need an utopianism in the way of an ideal state, state in the double sense of state and state of our situations. Yeah. But don't we need something like a soft utopia in the way of an idea of a better life?
My answer is no, we don't. Let me try to defend that. I know how unpopular this is. I think that building on this aversion, on the dissatisfaction of people with the lives that is this competitive production of profit, is creating. This is sufficient for now. Because if we all pool our energies, irrespectively of how of what form of life motivates us, we will be more successful than if we have a lot of intellectual energy spent on deciding on what model to endorse. So also strategic. So first of all, it is not necessary. Remember, the transition from feudalism to capitalism didn't happen through some kind of a blueprint that they said, let's build capitalism. Actually, the name capitalism was coined about 100 years after
the bourgeoisie had an idea of a civilized life and how to have an educated and talent and bring your talents. They had an idea of a human life.
Sure, but they didn't have all figured out that we're going to establish the private property of the means of production, pursuit profits, which is the description of capitalism. So that blueprint was not enough to transition. We don't need a blueprint to transition to something else. And actually, I think that experimentation, rather than pledging allegiance to all kinds of dogma, capitalism, socialism, welfare state, I think these labels are only in the way. That much as, and I take this theme, in fact, from Ivan's book, this effort to emulate, to copy, to cling on to some kind of a preconceived direction, I think this is doing more damage than help.
Last question, capitalism on edge. What is on edge? Capitalism isn't on edge. We are on edge. Yeah,
well, capitalism, and the title is not on the edge. It's not about to collapse, but it is on edge. It is nervous. It is feeling guilty if you look at the Davos Forum last year, it was all about the environment, how capitalism is polluting, inequalities. There, capitalism is unease. So, in that sense, the title captures the fact that even, you know...
So it's in trouble like
as
all the
a,
time since it started, it was in trouble.
Capitalism was always in trouble? No, I don't think so.
Okay.
But now, even when it is being successful in the game of the economic kind of pursuit of growth, you know, it is still creating growth. But even when it is doing its job well economically, socially, it is unhappy. So that condition of the discrepancy between economic prosperity, misery within the economic prosperity is what the title is about.
Thank you, Albena. Thank you, Ivan, for this part of our discussion. Now, we didn't talk about, but we involve our audience too, also under the circumstances of COVID-19. Without microphone. Maybe
yes.
Two or three questions from the audience. Take care that we can understand you, but also take care not to speak too loud. You know, it's a difficult life we have in the moment. Does anybody want to be involved? The gentleman in the first row.
Do you have, I didn't quite get, do you have some more concrete ideas about the invention or furthering the welfare of people? And what do you think about the basic income for everybody?
Okay, so universal basic income.
Yeah.
Universal basic income, it would reduce indeed this dependency on the jobs that are disappearing. So it would do its job in that sense. However, you know, our finances can go only that far. So one needs to think about wealth creation and wealth distribution. What do you do with this wealth? So I would prioritize funding essential social services before I give the money to universal basic income. This would be the priority for me. In the book, I also speak about universal basic employment. We should all work less, but we should all have at least, you know, the capacity to do a job if we want a job.
The right for work.
The right for work, in that sense. It's important because there is currently a very poor distribution between those who work more than they would like to out of insecurity and those who can never even get a job. So I appeal for a universal basic employment, for proper funding of public services, because with this illusion, that it's an illusion that equality is going to make our healthcare better. You know, we can be totally equal society and not fund our healthcare system. So.
Can I ask, because universal basic income, I do believe is a great idea, but if I was a very conservative politician, this was going to be my choice. Because honestly speaking, the work is becoming a privilege. And from this point of view, COVID-19 is quite interesting. When we all work from home, basically the border between working and not working starts to change. When you're unemployed, one of the things that you're missing a lot is there is no office where you can go, a production place and so on. Staying at home is something that you suffer a lot. And then now you start to redistribute, you're doing this, you're doing that, because if technology continues to develop, and particularly with automation, the basic problem is what you're doing with the people that you not need for production. How you're giving them the idea of dignity, of self-meaning, and this is not an easy story, because honestly speaking, you talk about profit, and I agree, but if you're right, one of the happiest places in the world is going to be rich American universities. Professors have basically 10-year jobs, so you have security. The money is there, but you should not, it's not a company, you should not compete for money. Paradoxically, I have never seen people talking as much about money as at the top universities. And it's not because people don't have money, but because you're competing for recognition. You're competing for other things. The very fact how much we are addicted to sport is telling you that competition is something deeper. It's not simply capitalism. This basically goes very much to human nature, because in order to get recognition of what you're doing, the meaning of life, and I agree very much that we should totally regulate this. We cannot go, this could be self-destructive, but it is not as easy. Mm-hmm. It is not as easy because it's not simply economic politics. This is our culture. And even people who are very cooperative otherwise, if you see how competitive, for example, how competitive we are bringing our kids. And nobody is bringing their kids more competitive, by the way, than left-wing professors. If you see basically how much you're basically insisting that your kids should be very successful in school and they should do this and this and this and this. And I do believe this is an interesting story because it's a cultural revolution of a dramatic nature.
Some more intervention? If not,
maybe one question about because you were mentioning about changing the game, changing the rules about competition and production and everything. Do you think that we have enough transparency, even in Europe, if we look at it, of how we do things and how we produce things, and to actually bring up the level to a more fair competition and to just not only in Europe, because we are very much we are very much dependent on resources from other continents and other cultures, and we do depend, our growth depends also on these resources. So how, even in the European Union, how can we see that there is going to be actually that change, not only on paper?
Yes. No, the issue of transparency. So that's another point that bugs me a lot. This trust now we are putting in democracy, that democracy is in crisis, has to pull itself out of it. But how do you do it? And for instance, people in Bulgaria have been for 3 months on protest against their corrupt governments, and there is indeed this sensitivity growing. But I think, and why is that? Why is that? Because people, how to say, since the financial collapse, there has been this push for more transparency and accountability of governments, and let's take the government down and change it with another. And yet, people came to realize that democratic accountability and the usual transparency doesn't do the job, because after the elections, the same happens. So, in fact, the first writings about accountability as a liberal idea of the free society was about specific accountability, taking somebody to give you an account, justification, proper justification of their policy. Now, this is what I think we need. And I've noticed that in Bulgaria, I spent 3 months there, I've been urging people to ask specific account of politicians, of our mayors, about things that are, why are you destroying this street, for instance, that is perfectly good. But people are not so ready to ask specific account, to seek, this rendering account is at the heart of successful societies, I think. Not, the general accountability, the democratic accountability is not enough. So what you said about transparency is part of that. It should be part of politicians or decision makers giving specific account for what they do. But then people have to ask for it. And it's a lot of time, and it's a lot of investment of time and energy.
That was my follow-up question, whether society is actually ready for that.
No, it is easier to go on the street and ask for the government to resign rather than ask for specific
and transparency can be extremely also manipulative on its own. Talking about Bulgaria, basically years ago, when the current prime minister became the prime minister for the first time, he declared that in 48 hours they're going to make public all the discussions of the Council of Ministers. The transcript of the discussion is published. So I was very much interested why he's doing this. So he said, this is the only way to close the mouths of your ministers. Because basically, if you go public, any disagreement with policies and so on is a governmental crisis. So as a result of making the Council of Ministers discussion very transparent, you're moving the real decision-making out of the Council of Ministers. And this kind of political games of transparency are extremely important. Some of, for example, the big corporations, if you listen to their talk, this is the most transparent things in the world. And by the way, when somebody is giving you too much information, this is also the way to hide information. This is why people trust investigative journalists, and they basically cannot go themselves to do this or that. So, but it's, transparency is a beautiful topic.
Yeah, and also, we see how the populism of the elites is in this move of transferring responsibility onto the people. Saying, no, okay, at some point the Prime Minister said, okay, tell me what you want me to do. But the street should not tell. The street should express a grievance. Should say, hey, something is amiss. The responsibility is to the politicians to do the work, and then to give account. That should be the normal process. Instead of that, they say, yes, transparency, and, you do it. That's not how we want our democracies to be.
Thank you, everybody who came to the Kreisky Forum. Thank you, everybody who watched by computer, YouTube, whatever. Thank you, Ivan, to be involved in this debate and help me discussing with Albena. And thank you, especially Albena. This was primarily your evening.
She was keeping us on edge.
On edge.
On edge,
Yes.
Albena Azmanova, Capitalism on Edge, the book we talked about. Thank you very much for this very inspiring and interesting book. I learned a lot. As I told before, I wasn't totally convinced with everything, but that wouldn't be expected. I assume that everybody is. And I think this was a very wonderful debate, and thank you. I hope we will meet again here in circumstances with less anxiety,
less anxiety
and less fear. Thank you very much.